Hi, welcome back to the Art of Business English. And today I've got a guest actually on for an episode today of the Art of Business English. I've got Loic Bellet, who is coming in from Johannesburg to outline to us a four-step process that he uses to give performance feedback to staff. And it's a very interesting episode today because what we're going to be looking at is really this really simple four-step process and the language that you can use to confidently give feedback to people, even though English may not be your first or native language. So sit back, grab a pen, and get ready as we're joined by Loic Bellet, who's going to dive deep into giving feedback and how we can use that to become more effective leaders. Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Art of Business English. Andrew Ambrosi is here for episode 118, and today I'm joined by Loic Bellet, who is going to be teaching us a little bit about how we can provide feedback to our team or to members of our staff, and how that's going to help us, especially if we are a non-English speaker. And I'm welcome Loic first. How are you, buddy?
Thank you, man. Thank you. Yeah, good to be here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, joining us from South Africa, from Joburg, right?
That's right. Yeah, bottom end of Africa.
Excellent. And how are things out there at the moment?
Well, we're going to be coming out of a level 5 lockdown, so we're pretty excited over here. But I do think it's not going to make much of a difference. Funny enough, we're still locked down.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same here. We were allowed to take the kids outside on the weekend, but it's more or less the same. It's very strange times we're living in. Anyway, buddy, I just wanted to thank you for joining us, and just get a little bit of background on your story as a coach or an English teacher trainer. I'm really excited about this topic as well because I think it's really relevant not only for those who are learning English. I mean, obviously, this is going to be an English speaking, to help those who are non-native English speakers. But this topic really it can be quite difficult to effectively provide feedback. And as we mentioned earlier, it's not really something that you're trained to do. So I think it's going to be an interesting talk today. So but before we get into it, let's just have a quick dive into your background.
Okay, so you may be surprised to learn that actually I'm not 100% native speaker in the sense that, well, I arrived in South Africa when I was about 12 years old. And at the time, I think I could say hello in English. That's about it.
That was like me when I arrived in Spain.
So it's what you would really call a full immersion. If you want to get anything done, if you want to eat, if you want to ask for directions, I mean, you'll have to learn. And obviously, as a youngster, you pick it up a lot sooner, you know. In fact, it's Italian origin. So the rest of the family is all in Italy. But I grew up in South Africa, so primary school, high school, all the way through all the studies. And basically, I learned the language to the point where a couple of years ago, I was literally qualified to teach it.
Mm-hmm. But you've been immersed in it for years then. But since you were 12. And do you still speak Italian well?
Yes, I do. Yeah, absolutely. And also French, because we spent many years in the Congo, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, formerly known as Zaire. Yeah.
So you're like trilingual then.
I guess I am. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sort of trilingual. Obviously I'm a native English speaker, and I speak Spanish, and I also speak Catalan because in Catalonia we speak Catalan. We don't actually speak Spanish.
I believe there is a difference. Yes.
Yeah, there is a difference. It's actually a different language. People think it's a dialect, but it's not a dialect. I mean, there are some overlapping similarities, but for example, when there is the Catalan Parliament shown on the Spanish national television, everything's subtitled in Spanish because if you're in Spain, you don't understand Catalan.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay. So you're actually you've been teaching for a while then?
Yeah, I've been teaching for about 3 years officially. And
Yeah.
prior to that, I was in business. So, well, I'm still in
Mhm.
business really.
Yeah.
And about 20 years worth. And I've worked in different parts of business from marketing, which is currently the area I'm in at the moment,
Hmm.
and back to production, operation, logistics. So I've got a kind of an experience across the board. And I've had an
Yeah.
experience working from an individual contributor on a team through to managing teams. So I've got some
Excellent.
idea of giving feedback. And as you said earlier, I think we get promoted to our levels of incompetence, and nobody teaches you how to do feedback. They just expect you to somehow know about it.
Yeah, I think that happens with a lot of business skills. We don't get taught how to run effective meetings. We don't get taught how to deliver engaging and powerful presentations. We're just expected to know this type of stuff,
Yeah,
which is skills that need to be worked on, leadership skills that need to be worked on. Being an effective communicator, and that's what we're about. That's what we're all about here at the Art of Business English. But that's what I think. It's great that you've had all this experience, and I've said that many times before. If you've listened to previous episodes of the Art of Business English, the best English teachers, in my opinion, are those who have had a lot of previous business experience, because then you've got a lot of perspective and all this experience that you can bring to the classroom. Whereas someone who, and this is not to take away from those who are just trained as teachers, but I feel that if you've just been at school, then you've gone to university and you've studied to be a teacher, and then you've started teaching, you don't have really. I mean, it depends on what you're teaching. I mean, if you're a genius mathematician, then obviously that's going to be great. But I think having a lot of this like external experience makes you a much more effective trainer or coach or teacher, and it brings a lot to the classroom. So that's great. So shall we move on to today's topic? I think it's a good bit of a segue into giving feedback. So I'm going to sit and listen because I've got a lot to learn. It sounds like today, because I managed teams as well, and yeah, giving feedback can be tough. You need to feel comfortable doing it. You need to sort of be sensitive about it, because some people are going to react differently to others, and you want to make sure that the expectation. I mean, that's the thing that I'd say. The expectations are very clear, but sometimes you don't feel that. I don't know why, but some people don't really feel comfortable saying what they want or saying really what they mean. So I'm going to hand over to you and let you enlighten us on today's topic.
yeah. Well, thank you for that. Thanks for the platform, I guess. Appreciate it. And
Yeah,
I think if we start right at the beginning, it's really about providing the staff with effective feedback, something that they can work on, something that's actionable. If you think of a sports person, if you think of an athlete, and they take a certain action and they get immediate feedback from the coach, and they're able to correct their actions the very next time they engage in a particular activity or an action. And that's really as close as you want to get with regards to that. And so, if you can deliver it effectively, you raise the performance of the entire organization, starting with the people around you, logically. So, the nice thing, though, and we've said it already, is that we don't get trained for this kind of thing. So, it turns out that even for native English speakers, it's challenging. And when you're not even speaking the language, it's not your language, it becomes quite difficult. Luckily, uh, there is a formula. So
great.
that's kind of what we're here to discuss, because basically providing regular feedback to your team so they know where they stand with you, that's important. But how do you do it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
How do you do
so
it effectively?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's quite right. Because, I think with a lot of managers, they want to focus on identifying mistakes and pointing out the mistakes to their team members.
Yeah.
However, the principle of the method that and I won't claim rights to it, it's basically something that comes out of manager tools, which is a different science that was put together by a couple in the United States. But without going into details, I've basically borrowed it from them because it is so effective.
Mm.
They've literally got 4 steps. They've got 4 steps that you can follow. And so there is a way to deliver that feedback using those 4 steps, and literally with exact words that you can repeat often. That's the idea. So that you don't have to innovate on the fly, so that you can safely rely on something. So where you would start is by observing behavior. You'd observe behavior and you would start with positive behavior, first of all. And I think we probably understand why. If you start with negative, people will be automatically a little reluctant to accept it. So you start by observing positive behavior that you identified has led to good performance. Now, you practice feedback on positive behavior for weeks, probably around 8 weeks when you're getting started into this. And you do that before you start rolling out any adjusting feedback. So ideally, you'd want to practice that for about 8 weeks. You don't want to start with negative behavior. Go with positive, because people will take to it so much more easily. And also, it'll give you an opportunity to practice it in a relatively safe manner, because people will tolerate it a lot better. So that's the one thing. You want to provide that feedback as close time-wise to the event. Again, if you think of an athlete, you take an action, you get feedback, you immediately correct it. However, I would not let perfect be the enemy of good. So the other way of looking at it is deliver it as close as you can to the actual activity. So you want to roll that out to them as close as you can to when you've observed it. Now, basically, feedback has to become as frequent and as comfortable as breathing. And it takes time, and it gets easier along the way.
Yeah, I think it's
So,
important.
yeah, because it mustn't be something that, and most of us would feel that way. We feel charged up. We feel we need to deliver this piece of information. They need to accept it. Now, quite often, the moment you focus on a mistake, the focus is on the past instead of the future. And with feedback, you're encouraging future behavior, effective future behavior. So, okay, the process. Let's talk about the process for a moment. So you ask the team member, and already here it's kind of a little different, because most people would call the person over and say, okay, I'm going to tell you what I think about everything. But we don't. So we ask the team member if we can share some feedback with them. Most likely they'll say yes. We then state the behavior, and we'll talk about that a little later. You then point out the resulting impact of that behavior. So the behavior first, then the impact that it had, and then you encourage effective future behavior by either thanking them or asking them for a change in behavior. Ideally, if they could come up with that change, and very often they can, you don't have to dictate what they should do differently. And the very nice thing, when they come up with their own solution, oh, I could do it this way, or I could do it that way, is that they now own that solution, and you can hold them accountable for it, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
So, and as I promised earlier, it comes right down to the words that you can use. So, all right, let's talk about step one. So step one is to ask. And for example, you would typically say something like, may I give you some feedback? It's as simple as
Of
that.
course.
Or may I share something with you? And again, most likely they'll just say yes. Step two, you state the behavior. Now you focus on the behavior, not the result. And this is very important. You're not looking at attitude. You're not looking at the intention or the motivation of the person, because that will be very, very difficult to justify in your conversation. So what you're looking for is things like the words that were used, ideally the exact words, precisely how they said those words, because that starts going towards attitude, but you cannot argue on attitude, but you can argue on rolling eyes, intonation of the words, that kind of thing. So
you would say,
body
like,
language.
when you turned away from me like that, something like
Yes,
that.
exactly. You've got facial expressions, you've got body language, you've got intonation patterns in the voice, you've got raised voices, low voices, condescending voices, and then, of course, the words that were actually used. So the last thing, which is the one most of us usually focus on, other than attitude and so on, is the actual quality of the work. So the output, quantity, quality, timeliness, and documents that might have been generated. But those are technical aspects. Those are normally relatively easy. So, all right, let's talk about some examples of giving feedback based on the above. Recommended, always start with when you. Sounds simple, but it works like this. If you start with when you, it'll enable you to focus on the behavior. So you don't have to think of how to initiate that conversation. You just focus on the behavior. For example, when you deliver X ahead of schedule, for example, think of it like this way. There are 3 dots after that. Okay, so it's basically when you do this, and we'll come to the next step. When you do something which is more than what was actually asked, you went one step further. Or some adjusting feedback. When you're late for meetings, for example, I mean, that's a very common one, right? Or when your product quality is low, and so on. Okay, that was step 2. Step 3, you point out the impact of that particular behavior. And so what you're saying is you're basically continuing on statement number 2. So now you're on your step 3, and you're going to say something like, what happens is, and so now you're going to state the impact, because you're saying, this is what happened. This is what I've observed as a result. Here's what happens. The team's performance drops across the board, for example. Or here's what happens. We delivered the project on time and the client was super happy. Or here is what happens. The boss is impressed. He comes back to us and the reputation of the entire team is affected positively. So you can deliver that as corrective behavior. You can encourage effective behavior, but basically pointing out what the impact was. So now we come to step 4, and you're encouraging future effective behavior. So you want them to do more of what works, and you want them ideally to change the behavior that led to, let's say, a negative impact on the organization. So here it's relatively easy. We either thank the person for doing this, or in the case of adjusting feedback, we might ask them what they could do differently. If they cannot come up with something, that's okay. We can point it out to them because that's also part of our jobs. So for example, some words that we could use. Senior management notices the effort that you've put in. Please keep it up. Or the client is happy and we can now continue to deliver some excellent service, which is what we're known for. Thank you. Or quite honestly, if there is some behavior that needs adjusting, you could literally, after you've pointed out step 2 and step 3, you now say, what can you do differently? They'll probably tell you what they could have done differently. They probably know.
Yeah.
So it's literally 4 steps. And look, there are some additional pointers because it doesn't always go smoothly. It doesn't always go according to that plan, you know. So for example, let's say you are upset as a manager about this situation. Don't give feedback. They'll pick it up. They'll pick it up in your tone, in your mannerisms, in your body language, and it's not going to go well. Remember, the purpose of...
What's the strategy then if you're upset, to just take a note and address it later? Or
no, do nothing. Because there'll be other opportunities. Absolutely. Now remember, we're encouraging future behavior. We're not going to delve in the past where they're going to justify their mistake. We're literally going to fix something if it needs to be fixed, of course, yes. But in terms of feedback on their behavior, just leave it, because you probably will have difficulty controlling yourself. So, okay, the purpose of the feedback, encouraging future effective behavior, not to punish, not to point out mistakes.
But that's common. I think that's what most people do. Most
managers, because
when they get angry, they burst out. What is it? This is ridiculous. I can't believe you did this. Why did you do that? And they're just like, boom, they unload on people. Yeah.
And that's probably what you were subjected to, right?
Yeah, I remember that happening to me on a number of occasions.
So Look, one very easy test when it comes to feedback, and without digressing too much, if you were to ask yourself, does the boss give me enough feedback on my performance? Usually the answer would be, no, I could do with a bit more feedback from him. And yet somehow we're under the impression that, hey, we communicate to our team all the time. We tell them exactly where they stand.
Exactly.
Maybe not so much.
I
So,
agree. I agree completely. I think it's strange. We're so busy. We're running around, and we have like plans for the organization, or we have this is where we're going this way, but we don't really effectively communicate that.
yeah,
And people are really not certain on their expectations. Or what I've often found is you think you've transmitted something effectively well to them, and in your mind it's clear. And then when you come back for another meeting, and what they bring back and what they deliver to you is just not what you thought. And then they're like, "Oh, I thought you meant that." And you're like, "Oh, but why? Why?" And that can be quite frustrating. But is that your fault? I mean, I guess it is if you're a manager and you're ineffective at
that
communicating what you
is
need.
such an interesting point. And
Yeah.
again, I think at this point we should say it, which is communication is what the listener does. Think
Mm.
about that.
Hmm.
You know, you can say something, you can say it in a certain way, and you can use certain mannerisms and body language when you say it. Now, it turns out science, somewhere along the line, gives us some percentages, and the percentage is something along the lines of about 7% of the communication that takes place is verbal. In other
Mm.
words, the words that were chosen. There is another percentage, 30 odd percent or so, which goes down to the way that it was delivered. And then something like 50 odd percent is body language, you
Yeah,
know,
non-verbal communication.
non-verbal
Exactly.
communication.
It's about 60%. People get about 60% of the message through non-verbal communication,
Absolutely.
which is quite interesting. Yeah.
And you've got to focus on what you can control because you cannot control the way that they're going to interpret the message. So the only thing you
Mm.
can do is optimize it once you've gotten to know them, which I'll address just before we close off because it is essential to address that. Um, if you understand the people, you'll be able to communicate to them in the way that they will understand it because communication is what the listener does.
Mm.
So, yeah, so if you're upset, rather just leave it. Um, you can you can actually avoid giving feedback. It is possible if you're upset, if they're not in that frame of mind. And again, you know,
Mm.
it sounds like you're being too lenient, but you're not. And the reason is because you've already, at that point, through the 4 steps, told them. You have given them the feedback anyway. That's what we call a shot across the bow, to basically say to them, hey, I've observed something. I'll observe it again. If it happens again, I'll give you additional feedback. And they pretty much will have gotten the point. So there's no need to continue to hammer the message home. So,
So you feel that when you're rectifying or adjusting, you're giving feedback for adjusting behavior for negative outcomes. You should limit that specific giving feedback on that specific behavioral point to once or twice.
look, you could give it 6 times on a
Mm.
particular type of behavior. And this is a very
Yeah.
important point. You could have individual pieces of behavior with individual pieces of feedback, and those would not accumulate and be amount to some kind of a corporate action. Many people believe that issuing a warning, issuing some kind of a reprimand, that's management. That's not management. That's a failure of management. Ideally,
Mm.
you want to, management, truly, performance is not sexy. It's kind of boring. It's like driving a car. Slight correction to the left, slight correction to the right. You never really want to drive into the barriers and swing the car around, as
Hmm.
cool as it may be in a movie. So
Yeah.
basically, so
Yeah.
yeah, so what you'd like to do ideally is just have small corrections compounded over time, and you'll find, I mean, the performance of the organization just, 1% better every day. We know
Yeah,
that.
that was my question. I mean, most people, it takes time to correct behavior. It needs
Yeah.
to be this positive. Well, you need to reinforce positive behavior and reinforce positive outcomes of or what you want of from negative behavior over time. Because if you just give people one piece of feedback randomly, it's like humans don't really learn like that. Humans learn what we call space learning. If you continually learn something repeatedly over time, then it becomes a part of you, or you adopt that learning mechanism, or you adopt that thing that you're supposed to learn. So your advice then is to continually give feedback, slightly adjusting over time.
Yeah, probably around a period of 8 weeks was positive, and then you start bringing in the negative, continuously looking out for positive behavior that you can reinforce, and then bringing in the adjusting behavior. And you're not punishing, you're not pointing out mistakes. There is also some guidance if the behavior is not being corrected.
Yeah, that was one of my questions, actually. What do we do when you are, the employee's positive, like, yeah, okay, yeah, I see what you mean, and I'm going to change. And like, you're like, okay, great. That was a really positive discussion. I'm glad we had that feedback session. And then, a week later, they're just doing the same thing. And then you're like, you correct it again. And no, there's smiles and they're all positive. And they're like, yeah, yes, of course, I'll get onto that. And then after a month, you're starting to wonder what's missing here.
Yeah, so that is something that Manager Tools calls systemic feedback. And what systemic feedback is that, first of all, it is a little more serious, although the feedback itself in its delivery doesn't change. So you're using virtually the same words, except now you're not focusing on the behavior. You're focusing on the fact that they've committed to a course of action over time, which has not manifested itself. So they've told you in their own words, most likely, that they will do something differently. But now they're not doing it. Now that is something that the organization cannot tolerate, because that means we are definitely on a downhill. We'll smack into something. We cannot work with people who commit to something and then don't do it. Mistakes, if we're learning from them, I don't think anybody truly in this day and age has a problem with that anymore. However, if the staff member just cannot get it right, then that needs to be addressed. And that then gets addressed in systemic feedback, which shifts the focus from the behavior of the individual pieces of feedback onto the fact that they have still not corrected it. So it's the correction that's not taking place. That's now what we're focusing on. And the reality is that in most cases, if we've done our managerial job, which is probably way more than what we can discuss here today, because it starts with hiring the right people in the first place. But if we've done that job properly, they will correct. And it won't take too many pieces of feedback to achieve that.
Yeah, definitely.
Look, basically, another of the big questions quite often is, what if the person refuses to listen to that feedback? They literally say, no,
I did it perfectly well. I answered the problem. I think you've got a problem, not me. You're always on my case about this. You're always on my case, and I'm doing my job well. It got done. What's the problem?
Yeah, exactly. So I would say that almost merits a section of its own. So first of all, they will most likely not refuse. So don't let that be the reason that you don't give the team feedback. So do go ahead. And you've pointed out a part of their behavior that they should change. So it is actually sufficient in terms of that. You have pointed it out already. So despite appearances, they got the point. And then consider that the team member is being defensive about.
Yeah, that's typical. Very typical. People get very defensive because they don't like to meet. Some people are submissive, so like, oh yeah, they put their head down and they drop their eyes. But some people, when they feel like they're being attacked, they get very defensive and then they push back hard.
Yeah, quite right. And remember, they're looking at a behavior, or quite possibly, depending on how you've dealt with it. Remember, listening is what, communication is what the listener does. So they might have interpreted it as pointing out a mistake, which they will then refute logically. But it occurred in the past. And we want to encourage effective future behavior. We've got to remember that. So quite frankly, don't engage. It sounds counterintuitive, but don't engage. Just smile with the confidence of somebody who wears a sign on his head that says, watch out, I'm the boss, I could fire you.
Mm-hmm.
You are still the boss. So you walk away calmly. You allow them to think that they've won an argument. You literally say, I can see this is not the time to talk about this. You know what? You're forgiven. And you leave it. You leave it. Again, it sounds very counterintuitive, but remember, there is a difference between giving the feedback and making changes to the mistake. So the mistake still needs to be rectified, whatever it is, whether it was a document that was not handled correctly. But the feedback means that the future document will be handled correctly. That's what we're focusing on, the learning. So I must say, I think one must also caution the feedback method is most effective when you have built up trust with your employees.
I definitely agree
This is
there.
very important. And that is something that Manager Tools calls a weekly one-on-one. And the weekly one-on-one is basically a 30-minute session, never missed. You sit down with the staff member, you spend 10 minutes on yourself, 10 minutes on them, and 10 minutes talking about the future. And they eventually have that trust. It runs for about 12 weeks before you bring in feedback. But what I'm saying is that feedback is kind of a second level once you've got the trust of your people. Without the trust, they will interpret it as some kind of action, some kind of, they're being victimized. And you don't want that.
Like, oh dear, I've got my one-on-one meeting every week and I'm worried because I'm going to be criticized. However, I mean, that will have some logistical limitations depending on the size of your team. I mean,
well, here's the thing. I actually worked it out. And what you're asking for from half an hour per team member, and remember, we're all working managers, it's true. We've all got some technical responsibilities, but we are talking about something like 2%. Work it out.
Of you.
30 minutes over the course of a week, it's actually not a lot. And so when you look at it in the context, making 30 minutes available, it's not too much to ask.
My problem with that would be if you had 10 members of staff.
Yes.
That's going to mean that you'll have to spend, 300 minutes of one-on-one time a week, which could be good, or it depends on how much work you can delegate to other people from your workload. One-on-ones.
Look at it this way. Say you've got 10 people. Say you've got 5 days. Say that you allow each one of them to have chosen a day. You're talking about 2 people per day, half an hour each.
Yeah.
But I do get your point, of course. And normally there's a lot that comes down to structure of the organization because, and I think the Army does this pretty well. They've got a very clear line of, a very clear structure as to how many people can realistically report to any one other person. And overall, I believe it is possible to know the names of up to 150 people that, let's say, report to you. But in your team, normally it's somewhere around 5 to 10 people, generally.
Normally.
Because at that point, you start bringing in some level of supervision. And if you can do your job correctly, the supervisors should also be passing on feedback to those that work with them.
Yeah.
See how it kind of waterfalls down.
Yeah. And I think having that 30-minute, this is what people fail to often calculate, having just that 30-minute one-on-one call or meeting with people, it can often lead to a much more productivity in the long run because you don't need to then address issues that pop up in the future that occupy even more of your time because everyone's very clear on where they're on their expectations, the direction that they need to go in. And that saves time in the long run. People often fail to calculate these, like they think, this is so much time invested in these meetings, but often that can mitigate many problems down the road and actually would save you more time anyway in the end.
Loads of time. I mean, I have a 5 to 10 minutes sit down with my staff member every morning, never missed. It's 8 o'clock. She comes to me. I don't need to ask. We then have a one-on-one, which is basically once a week. We go through some more details. And then the feedback becomes literally like breathing. Like there is no defensiveness about it. You approach the person, you say, hey, can I give you some feedback? Sure. Okay, well, when you do something in this way, this is what happens. Okay. Can you do something differently? Yeah, I think I need to change this. Okay, no problem. And that's it.
It's done.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, again, all of this is adapted from something else. It's not that I invented this, but
Yeah.
it really, really works.
Now, what about? I've got a few more questions. What
Sure.
about people who brush things under the carpet? I mean, that's common as well. Some people are like, it's okay this time. I'll let it go. No, it's okay this time. I'll let it go. Because some people, even if you're in a managerial position, maybe you got there because you're very charismatic and you try and avoid conflict. You're like
Yeah,
a happy-go-lucky guy. Everyone loves you. You've been promoted because you're good at your job, but you're also really like popular amongst like the other team members, and you don't like conflict. So you just let things go a bit and push them under the carpet because you're trying to avoid conflict because you don't want people to get upset.
correct.
You got any advice for
100%.
that? Yeah.
Yeah, so the advice I would have is we need to get out of our comfort zone. We need to start regularly chatting to the people initially. Then we have a bit of a more formal sit down until you've got their trust. Because the truth is, when you need to deliver that kind of feedback, if you've got that, if you've had the quantity, the frequency of communication with them, I'm not talking feedback, I'm just saying the frequency of quality communication with them so that you've built up trust, you don't
Yeah.
need to sweep anything under the carpet because
Exactly.
you can just address it there and then. They will not be defensive. It's not going to be an uncomfortable conversation. Usually it's around 10 to 15 seconds anyway. Isn't that the funny thing? We've got
Yeah.
these mental monuments in our heads that we don't want to deal with something. And realistically, we're talking 10 to 15 seconds of feedback.
Yeah.
And then it's
Everything else.
over.
That's quite interesting. But I completely agree. If you are comfortable and you've had this practice and there's that level of trust, then yeah, you shouldn't need to push things or sweep things under the carpet because you'll be comfortable giving that feedback. But I do have another question. What about how do you deal with overly sensitive people? Some people who really I'm sorry, I thought I was doing a good job. And then I didn't, it's not that, I think you've got all types of characters in an
You
organization.
do. Yeah, you do. So the first thing is through those one-on-ones, you'll get to know who they are. And, I'm not trying to
Yeah.
run away from the question, but the truth is that there is a system in place in this kind of, I wouldn't say philosophy, but sort of approach to management. That
Methodology, yeah, approach. Yeah.
methodology, yeah, it's a methodology that will allow you to have the relationship with that person. The thing of it is, and you pointed out something now in terms of the response from a management point of view, which is to try and placate them, to try and calm them down. And that I wouldn't recommend. I would literally recommend keeping it clean, keeping it clear. You deliver your feedback. Again, they've got it. You've pointed it out. You've achieved your objective. And then you move on. Because within a week, you've got that one on one with that person. And you'll be able to go back to your notes, which you would have made on a daily basis. We make notes about our people. And you'd be able to go back and address that issue. Now, of course, there's sensitivity and then there's chronic sensitivity,
Yeah.
which is something that at some point you might have to deliver feedback on that too, because
Yeah.
it's not effective behavior. And
No,
it
it's not.
basically comes down to, hey, can I share something with you? When I tell you this, and when I share something with you, and this is how you respond, here's what happens. And then you explain to them the negative consequences of that behavior. Ask them
Yeah.
if they
So
can do something differently.
you're just recycling that mantra. Okay. Well, I love the process. It's quite simple and it's quite straightforward. So the language is quite simple for our listeners, which is also great. So it's just basically like, hey, can I just give you some feedback or something? Or can I just tell you something? Or have you got a sec? Do you mind if I just share
Yes,
something with you? And we're like, oh, yeah, what's
exactly.
up? Well, I was just saying, when you arrive late to meetings every week, the next step is then we always have to start late, and that is frustrating other members of the
Yes.
team. Is that working? Am I getting it right here?
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
again, the 4 steps: ask first, let them willingly accept it. Secondly,
Hmm.
state the behavior. When you
Yeah.
do this.
Yeah.
Third, state the impact. Here's what
Mm.
happens. And fourth,
Yeah.
what could you do differently? Most likely they'll tell you, yeah, I'll try and be on time in future. Great.
Yeah.
And let them come late again and give them feedback again. Eventually, you'll come to the point where you say, okay, look, here's what happens. When you continuously make promises to me about changing your behavior and you don't, I start to question the future. And of course, you're taking it to a different level, and that brings into question other things. For example, if there was something like a promotions list, and they were possibly not going to be on that list as a result of this chronic kind of behavior, you would have to be very sure that you stick to whatever consequences you're pointing out to them, or else you'll lose credibility too.
Yeah,
But
of
again,
course.
that's something that's totally separate. It's another aspect of management which is beyond this. But I think the focus, if I was to sum it up in one sentence, it's encourage effective future behavior. Come to think of it, we could even go through some kind of vocab, because it's got very specific words, this methodology. I don't know if you'd be open to that, maybe.
Yeah, of course, of course, of course. Go ahead.
All right, let's look at it. So let's talk about feedback. Feedback, it's basically giving information about how a person did their work, and this is used for them to improve. That's feedback. Performance. Let's talk about performance, because that's what it comes down to. It translates into performance. So that would be the action or the process of performing a function. It's pretty straightforward. Performance. Now, facial expression. So what are we talking about there? We're talking about the non-verbal cues that come out in terms of how you flex those muscles in your face, and they communicate how you feel. Very important. If you're smiling at a client while delivering some information to them, or if you're not, that can affect the outcome. And yet, technically speaking, you said the words, you said please and thank you, you said all of that. So facial expressions, body language, movements and shape of your body, which you may or may not be aware of, and that's where the manager comes in, because the manager is observing this. And they also communicate your feelings, which enrich that communication to the next person. If we talk about behavior, and this is quite important, it's the way in which you act and you perform your work. So it's very technical. It's very clear. It's not about motivation. It's not about intention. We've just got to focus on the behavior and encourage future effective behavior. And if we look at the impact on the organization, what is an impact? An impact is an effect or an influence on something else. That's what it is. It's an impact on the organization. So you act on something, and that thing feels the impact of what you're doing. Encourage. Okay, what are we trying to do? We're encouraging future effective behavior. And that's basically coming down to stimulating the development of all the behavior in a certain direction. You're encouraging to go in a certain way. And basically, look, and it's worth repeating at least one more time. 4 steps. Ask, may I? State, when you do this, state the impact. Here's what happens. And at the end, it's either positive, in which case you say, hey, I just want to say thank you for that. Please do more of it. Or, quite frankly, what can you do differently? And if you have to point it out to them, say, do you think you could do this in future? Most likely they'll say yes.
Yeah. Great. Now, I'm going to ask you for some book recommendations, and maybe some people could read up on this if they're interested in taking it further.
Yeah.
Would you recommend the books?
I would.
Huh?
So it depends on the level of the listener. If they're into it, look up Peter Drucker, and I think we can probably post in the show notes the exact details. I think it was called The Effective Executive. But he wrote he's the quintessential management personality. He died, I think, in the 90s or so. Either that or he was 95 when he died. I can't remember exactly, but Peter Drucker. Otherwise, literally go and look up manager tools. So that's the name of the organization. And Mark Horstman literally wrote the book called The Effective Manager. And it contains the step-by-step of the one-on-ones, the feedback, and something else they call coaching. And those three together make up sort of the trinity of the entire sort of methodology that they have.
Excellent.
So I would recommend those two books.
I would recommend The Coaching Habit, and that was a good book too, because I think with The Coaching Habit, we could mix some of the tips from The Coaching Habit into this 4-part process. Because if it's going on to a bit of a longer discussion, for example, he said like the first step is like, what's on your mind? I mean, but once you've got the conversation going, and then you can delve a bit deeper. And what else seems to be the issue here with this then? And then one of the great questions is, what's the real challenge for you here? So then you try and again, this is all coming down to you asking questions and then listening into trying to really understand what's going on in the mind of that employee.
Absolutely.
And there's also a step which is good. He says, what do you want? That's the next step. But I like this one. How can I help as well? You can actually like, how can I help to make you improve? Or how can I help you to achieve this change or positive change in behavior or what may. And so I think that The Coaching Habit would be a good book to read as well. And then there's the classic, of course, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Of course,
which I think everyone should read that book. I always encourage all my students to read it, even if it's in their native language, because if you can take away some of the stuff from those books, they're great. Well, is there anything else we've missed? I think you've outlined it.
We've covered all of it. I think maybe just touching on that last point from The Coaching Habit, which is, it's not to say when you've delivered multiple pieces of feedback that there won't be some sort of asking them what you can do to help. It's some kind of, it goes back to the servant leader, where you're saying to them, look, I've got to get work done through you, and it's not going to happen by itself. I'm here to help. You know?
Excellent.
So
Well, we need to. I mean, we as managers and owners of companies or leaders, we need to enable our employees to do their best. We can't expect them to work magic from nothing. So the more help they can get and the more tools that we can make available to them, the better. Well, Loic, that's been really, really insightful and very interesting. Where can people catch up with you and read maybe some of your material or connect with you on social media? How can people get in touch with you if they're interested?
So I think they could start on the website. So I've got my website is speakproperenglish.com. Speakproperenglish.com. And alternatively, they can just pop me an email, and it's literally name-surname@gmail.com. So that's loicbellet@gmail.com. That's I reply to all those messages.
Excellent. And what about anyone? You got a social media handle? Have you got an Instagram or Facebook?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's instagram.com and then /speakproperenglish.
Okay,
and then on Facebook, the same.
Speak Proper. So that's PROPER. Speak
right.
Proper English.
Yeah.
Well, we all want to speak proper English, even us natives. Well, Loic, that's been a real pleasure having you here on the Art of Business English. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing that with us, and appreciate your time. Thanks to all my listeners. If you've heard the kids running around and the dog barking, well, that's just a part of being in confinement with the family for the past 7 weeks. So thanks very much again, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Right. Cheers, buddy.
Thank you.
Take care and bye for now. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. I'm sure you found it very insightful. Thank you once again to Loic for joining us and taking the time to explain to us this 4-step process of how you can give more effective feedback and how it can be done quite simply using some pretty basic expressions in the English language. I'm sure that even if English is not your first language, you can even use this process and translate the steps into your own native language and apply that in your work environment. Maybe you'll feel more confident mastering this feedback giving skill in your native language first before you then try and do it in English. Nonetheless, it's been a very insightful episode. I'll be sure to take away some of the ideas from Loic and merge them with some of my skills and some of the things that I do for giving feedback with my team. And be sure to check out the show notes and some of the links from the things that we discussed in the episode. Well, that's it from me, my friends. Thank you once again for joining me here at the Art of Business English. I'll see you all next week and take care. Bye for now.